In 1947, the United States offered to give away around $13 billion to rebuild a shattered continent, including, in theory, its own enemies. It was either one of the most generous acts in history or one of the most calculated, possibly both. A quick reminder, the Truman Doctrine had just committed America to containing communism. But Truman and his advisors understood something important. Communism did arrive by invasion, but it also arrived where people were desperate. And in 1947, most of Europe was desperate. 2 years after the war, Western Europe had still not recovered. Cities lay in rubble, factories were destroyed, farmland ruined, and trade had collapsed. Then came the winter of 1947, one of the coldest on records. People genuinely froze and starved. To America's Secretary of State, George Marshall, this was not just a humanitarian tragedy. It was a political danger. He looked at hungry, hopeless populations across Europe and saw the perfect breeding ground for communism. In France and Italy, large communist parties were already winning support at the ballot box. Marshall put it plainly. The enemy, he said, was not any country or doctrine, it was hunger, poverty, desperation and chaos. Fix those and you starve communism of the very thing it fed on. In June 1947, in a speech at Harvard, Marshall laid out the offer. The United States would provide huge financial aid to help Europe rebuild. Money, raw materials, machinery and food. It became known as the Marshall Plan or Marshall Aid. In the end, around $13 billion flowed across the Atlantic, an enormous sum for the time. And here is the striking part. The offer was open to everyone, not just Western Europe. The Soviet Union and its eastern satellite states were invited too. Stalin refused, and he forbade the countries under his control from taking a single dollar. To Stalin, Marshall Aid was a trap. Dollar imperialism, he called it. Accept American money and you would become dependent on America. Open your economy to it and slip out of Moscow's grip. He was not entirely wrong. So 16 Western European countries took the aid. The East took none. The line Churchill had described was now an economic fact drawn in American dollars. The results were dramatic. Western Europe's economies recovered far faster than anyone expected. Living standards rose, support for communist parties in the West fell away, and the Western nations were bound tightly to the United States, economically and therefore politically. Truman himself described the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan as two halves of the same walnut. One was the political and military commitment to contain communism. The other was the economic engine that made containment work. Stalin answered in kind. He tightened his hold over the East and soon built a rival communist economic system to bind his satellite states to Moscow. Europe was no longer only politically divided, it was now two separate economies turned away from one another. So, what was the Marshall Plan really? Generosity or self-interest? One interpretation was that it was largely generous, and it worked. America used its wealth to rescue a starving continent, rebuild democracy, and prevent the kind of chaos that had bred dictators the last time round. Millions of Europeans had better lives because of it. The other interpretation was that Marshall Aid was a weapon. The aid bought America loyal allies and open markets for American goods. It extended its influence across half a continent and was designed from the very start to defeat communism. And by forcing Stalin to reject it and wall off his bloc, it deepened the very division it claimed to heal. As is so often in this story, both are true at once. The Marshall Aid did feed hungry people and it did fight a Cold War. By 1948, the two sides had drawn their lines with words and with money. But there was one place where those lines physically crossed, where the capitalist West and the communist East stood face to face in the same ruined city. Stalin decided it was time to force the issue there, and he would do it not with an army but by closing a road.